So welcome to episode 61 of Now and Men, the podcast on men, masculinities and gender equality. I'm Sandy Ruxton and I'm here with my co-host Stephen Burrell. So Stephen, you've been in Iceland recently. What were you doing there and how was it?
Yes, hi Sandy and hi everybody. So I was in Iceland giving a few talks about my research and also doing some sightseeing, and it's such a beautiful and amazing country, and it's very interesting as well because this year actually marks 50 years since they had the women's strike there, which was a hugely significant in advancing women's rights in the country, and so there were kind of marches and a strike this year to mark that as well. And of course there is a great deal we can learn from Iceland, but it was interesting as well because some of the people there were keen to emphasise, that they do also have big challenges, whether that's backlash or men's violence against women or just rigid gender norms. And actually it can be kind of unhelpful to suggest that somehow Iceland has already achieved gender equality, because that same discourse can be used by kind of anti-feminist groups. So yeah, it was very interesting. But how about you, Sandy? What have you been getting up to?
Well, nothing quite as exciting as that, Stephen. But I have been to at least 5 musical events in the last week, including a Christmas concert by my choir. And I'm sorry you missed our rendition of Chapel Rowan's Pink Pony Club, which is a metaphor for queer liberation and self-discovery, as I'm sure you're aware. But given you've been in Iceland, which I think has some of the most progressive policies in the world on leave arrangements and on involving men in care, despite what you've said about their position on gender equality, it's very appropriate today that our guest is Anna Tarrant, whose work is also in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. So Anna is a professor of sociology at the University of Lincoln in the UK, and she's a UKRI, that's UK Research and Innovation Future Leaders Fellow, as well as being the director of the Centre for Inclusion in Fatherhood and Family Research at the University of Lincoln. Her research focuses on men's care responsibilities and their welfare and support needs, particularly in low-income families. And so her work kind of highlights how men from marginalised backgrounds are challenging gender norms and seeking to kind of care for children, especially among young fathers. So she's an author or co-author of several books in recent years, including Fathering and Poverty and The Dynamics of Young Fatherhood, which were both published by Policy Press. And her most recent work is on father inclusion and its potential for social transformation for individuals, services, and in policymaking. So we'll put some links to her work, as always, in the show notes.
Yes, and Anna and I also worked together a few years ago on an open university project called Beyond Male Role Models. And at the risk of blowing our own Now and Men trumpet, Stephen and I have a chapter on men, work and care in the UK in the context of COVID-19 in a collection called Men and Welfare, which Anna co-edited in 2022 with Lindsay Ladlow and Laura Way. So it's great to speak to you today on the podcast, Anna. We've often been told there's a crisis of masculinity among boys, that a key cause is fatherlessness and a lack of male role models. And this explanation has been around for many years. I mean, I'm old enough to remember, for example, the controversial early 90s work by UK sociologists Norman Dennis and George Erdos called Families Without Fatherhood, where they argued that father absence in families, especially working class ones, leads to increased crime, antisocial behaviour, poor educational outcomes, particularly for boys. And these kinds of ideas have surfaced recently in the Lost Boys report from the right-leaning think tank, the Centre for Social Justice, and also were cited in the former England football manager Gareth Southgate's Richard Dimbleby lecture. So I wanted to ask you to kick off, why is it that this thesis is so enduring, and why do you think it's insufficient? And related to that also, perhaps, why is it that working class fathers are routinely portrayed as feckless and failing?
Brilliant questions, and there's so much complexity to all of those. But it's something that's interested me for a long time. I started my research career speaking to granddads about what they do in family contexts, particularly as older men. And over time, that kind of transitioned into an observation that there was a lack of data or a lack of insight about the realities of men's lives and the kinds of ways in which they participate in families, particularly in low-income contexts. And the Beyond Male Role Models project that we worked on together, way over a decade now, which is quite quite scary. But at that time, there was a resurgence of this narrative. At the time, there were urban riots riots, there was a lot of unrest, the global economy had collapsed, all but collapsed, and politicians particularly sort of started to blame families. So the explanations for boys and young men going out and rioting was lone motherhood and absent fathers. And I found that really troubling. These kinds of narratives accrue very much to working class families and communities. What they do is they individualise and they blame families. They blame particular individuals in particular families for a whole range of different challenging social contexts and processes. The problem with the crisis narrative is that it ignores how things like poverty, insecure work, welfare policy, and even family law shape men's ability to be present and to participate. So it's not to say that young men empirically don't talk about that their dads might not be there for them, but actually what we're not doing is asking where they've gone to. Why are they not there? Why is it an empirical reality for some young men that dads aren't having in a relationship with them? A lot of the research around fatherhood and the way we think about fatherhood and good fatherhood is based on this idea of somebody who's typically resident in a household, economically providing, and also in a stable heterosexual couple. So anything that sort of sits outside of that or looks different tends to, again, attract that kind of criticism, that that's not the right way of doing family, or that's not the right way of doing fatherhood. So my work's kind of pushed beyond that, really. It's been about, well, if they're not there, if they're not in a household, where are they? Sometimes they are living in other households. But again, we're not looking necessarily at the kinds of relationships that those men are having with their children across households. So the way we frame, again, what fatherhood looks like makes or renders invisible different forms of family practices that are actually going on. If we look to social policy, we're not providing the kind of systems and supports that fathers tell us they need. We're not seeing different intergenerational roles of men and how they're involved in caregiving. So as uncles, brothers, as grandparents. So that kind of siloed focus on fatherhood actually renders, again, invisible all these different forms of men's participation that I sought to uncover in my book, Fathering in Poverty, and talk about. So we have to be very careful about the kind of political and moralisation processes that go on when we individualise and blame particular fathers or particular communities. And I think also as sociologists, we need to look at the systems. We need to think about the processes that actually served absent men from particular sets of households and particular sets of relationships.
I mean, I think I'm right to say that in your recent work on father inclusion, you say that rather than being simply absent or unwilling, it's fathers generally want to be involved in their children's lives, but face numerous challenges. I mean, you've laid out some of those already that can make this more difficult. Do you want to say any more about some of those challenges? I mean, some of them are quite practical challenges, aren't they, about where a guy lives and what employment he has and so on?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So one thing that I've been really fascinated by is looking at data historically about that involves men, and they're talking about their family relationships. So with my colleague Karen Hughes, we published a book called Men, Families and Poverty, and we looked at a sweep of 20 years worth of data with men to sort of track and trace their sort of the processes of family that they go through over time. And in doing that, what we're able to see is the implications of economic restructuring. We're able to see relationship change and dynamics. We're able to see the ways in which they're supported or not supported in particular policy or welfare contexts. The lens that we bring to that data is what helps us to actually render the different kinds of men's participation more visible. It's really interesting. If we look at men historically as just as breadwinners, we don't necessarily then look at them as caregivers or as people who are participating in support of families in particular ways. If we don't look at economic provisioning that's related to the state, related to welfare income. Again, we sort of then might rebrand them as failed fathers or failed breadwinners, as opposed to fathers who are participating in very particular ways in sustaining their families. again, if we look at in low-income communities, for example, we can see these kind of long histories and repeats of particular patterns or particular processes of impoverishment that can lead people to end up in prisons, for example, which is another form of absence. But my question there again would be, how do we support those men to still maintain their relationships and sustain those relationships with their children when that occurs? If we look internationally, things like forced migration, economic migration, can also lead to particular forms of absence. If we look at family law, there's a situation where women are seen as the kind of the key caregivers. These are very gendered processes, and that can lead men to be separated from their children, either physically through the household, or in other ways. So again, we need to understand those processes. We need to understand what it is that's creating the absence, so that we can then address those processes. If we focus too much on individual men, we don't necessarily then fully understand the problems and the complexities that are actually going on for people as they navigate their family lives.
I was thinking while you were talking about, particularly about housing policy, because of course there's a lack of housing in the UK, and desperate need for more social housing. Yeah. And of course, when families separate, it's usually the guy who leaves. He may not then have accommodation which he can support his children in. I think that's a pretty big issue and bumps into other issues about housing policy more generally.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been leading a major research study on young fatherhood in particular. And young fathers really are some of the most disadvantaged in terms of housing. Very often they're not asked if they're fathers in the first place. They're treated as single men. Women and children are prioritised, which is absolutely, really important. But what happens is that they get placed in hostels or in spaces where there actually might be safeguarding risks, and they can't have their children come and visit them. There's a really, really powerful case. I'll call him Adam, it's a pseudonym, but again, one of our participants that we followed for a 10-year period through that study. And he talks really poignantly about being in his hostel. The person next door was a drug addict. Someone on the other side was an alcoholic. And the way he was able to connect with his son was through his telephone and looking at pictures of his son on his phone. Or he had to travel, several buses to get to visit his child. And when you're on a low income already, when you don't have transportation, again, all of these are sort of processes or sort of infrastructural problems that get in the way of being able to sustain that relationship with that child. So housing is there's a lot to be done, I think, with housing. It's a major form of welfare that we don't often really think about, but is absolutely essential to sustaining that relationship.
I can imagine some of the things you're discussing would really affect how you see yourself as well. That if from the outset society is suggesting that you're a kind of failed father, that it might build this sense of shame and a lack of confidence then to actually feel like you can actually play a positive role. So why is it, do you think, that young fathers continue to be often constructed as being a kind of social problem and considered as being largely responsible for their own marginalisation? And are there differences between how young mothers and young fathers are seen?
There's a real parallel, I think, with the crisis of fatherlessness. It's very easy, again, to castigate and blame young people. Culturally, we have expectations around what is the right age to become a parent. And we associate that with having all of the package deal, to use Townshend's idea, of, again, being resident, economically stable and providing, having a stable relationship with mum or co-parent. And when you're 15, 16, you're still a young person. You're still learning who you are yourself. And very often, rather than sort of celebrating parenthood, which we would normally do, these young men are told they've ruined their lives. And to hear that is incredibly damaging. And one of the problems, really, again, for me, is that it's a social problem. So we're in a situation where it's become much harder to secure housing. The housing market is incredibly expensive. It's increasingly privatised, and being able to save for a mortgage is much harder. So we've got young people who are living with their parents and their families for much, much longer than they ever used to. There's a presumption there in policy that families will be there and will be able to support. And lots of teenage pregnancies do occur in areas of deprivation and are related to poverty and impoverishment, but not always. So they're already starting on kind of an insecure footing economically. Of course, then you're trying to balance your education with your caregiving, and in the UK we don't offer paternity leave or parental leave to people in education. We've been doing some research in Sweden where they do that, and what that means is that the young men are able to better balance both things. In the UK, we don't provide that. We don't create the conditions for young men to sustain their and create a stable education experience that then helps them into employment, that helps them later on. We've talked about housing. So a lot of the young men who are in, particularly in low-income communities, end up living with their own parents, with siblings. They talk about overcrowding. So again, all of these kind of broader social problems end up being allocated back to the young parent. You asked a question about young fathers and young mothers. Again, I think there are parallels, but there are differences as well. The parallels are that there have been a lot of policy assumptions that young people are trying to have babies so they can access the things they need to have an independent life. So again, young motherhood was talked about as an opportunity for welfare dependency. You get a house if you have a baby. Very, very challenging and sort of disappointing assumptions, really. A lot of young women, they absolutely want to be there for their children, and the same with young men. They don't always have children in a planned way. So this idea that it's a choice, a welfare-based choice, again, is really problematic, and it really does accrue to particular groups or populations where people do things in a way that we don't see as normal, or again, in line with the norm. Again, the problem with calling them a problem is that you don't provide the opportunities for them to be there for their children and to invest in family life in the way that's beneficial for them.
I want to return to one issue which you mentioned earlier about the response of family and public health services, and you said that quite often fathers are sidelined. Do you want to say a bit more about that issue? Because I think you are actively working on it, and why that should be. What are the reasons behind that?
Yeah, definitely. So one thing I didn't say, and I think it's important to clarify, is that we've also been working with professionals through the research as well, because we're trying to understand what their experience professionally is of engaging with fathers, and professionals across sectors, in education, in public health and social services, are telling us that they recognise that there's a need to better support fathers, to recognise fathers, and to bring them into the work in more effective and transformative ways. But they themselves experience a range of different challenges as well, and the challenges, I think, of engaging with men are broad ranging. So they're interpersonal. They're about kind of the relationships between professionals and fathers, but they're also cultural and organisational as well. And historically, services have supported women, and again, that's really necessary and really important. But dads have kind of been positioned as this kind of periphery or secondary caregiver or person in the family context, and that's again led to some of the absenting from professional support. Sometimes the interpersonal elements are assumptions that dads don't want to be involved, or they're not interested, and that's often because they can't be present at the time of appointments. They might be, again, working. Most appointments are sort of within a working day, so that renders them invisible. They might not be able to get leave, or might not be able to get time away from work, because employers don't necessarily see men in terms of their caregiving roles. So again, we just need to look much more broadly at what it is that's creating that absence that can sometimes unconsciously be seen as men just don't care. And we know that's not the case. Again, culturally, I think, and organisationally, there are very basic things that can be changed. We don't necessarily always collect data about dads. We don't ask about dads other than to check if he might be a risk, and that can feed into these narratives that men are more of a risk than they are a resource, and that's a language, again, we can be quite critical of. It's quite a binary language, and our colleague Breach Featherstone talks about that in the social work context. So simple things like just creating an admin form that has dad's information on it means that professionals are better equipped to know who dad is and to be able to engage with him, and to do that kind of proactive forms of father engagement that currently are really difficult to do and unsustainable. So yeah, there's a whole range of different factors within the system again.
Yeah, and I guess the fact that a lot of services are still female dominated, working primarily with women for the reasons you've stated, makes it much harder for men to just go through the door.
Yeah.
And I know from working on this issue years ago, it was the same then.
Yeah.
And I'm scared that we haven't really moved forward as much as we perhaps should have done on this.
Yeah, and one thing that we've identified as well is there's a real lack of training around father inclusion and what that looks like, what that means. That's something we're trying to address through the new research centre. Trying to work with professionals across different sectors. The framing of father inclusion is about focus on systems and services, because we want to avoid blame. It's about explaining. So why is this the case? Why is it that professionals are struggling to engage? They want to, but don't necessarily have the tools or the opportunities to do that. Sometimes it can just be really effective of going, how are you, dad? So if dad is present, turning around and saying, how are you, dad? We know that 1 in 10 men, particularly in the perinatal period, experience mental health challenges, and we're not seeing that. There's screening for that increasingly in the NHS, but that's not always being conducted. And it's about seeing dad as an important parent, as mum, and perhaps just bringing different things to that relationship.
So what role would you say gender norms play as well, Anna, in undermining father inclusion? So, for example, does the kind of expectation about men being the provider, does that then make them perhaps sometimes less keen to take on the role of nurturer? Or do many men perhaps still view asking for help with parenting as potentially being a kind of sign of weakness or failure?
So I think it's really the case still that men are expected to be a provider. But increasingly we have seen a cultural shift, and this is international, not just locally or nationally, but a shift towards men telling us that they want to be more involved and they want to be more engaged with their children. Again, the things that get in the way of that tend to be quite outdated sort of gendered assumptions now. It tends to be things like lack of space to be recognised as a father or as a caregiver by employers. Again, we talked earlier about systems and services, kind of positioning men as secondary parents and secondary caregivers. But those ideas are still hold sway. And I think that's a really important thing. And one of the things that gets in the way of thinking about being father inclusive is, again, that assumption that men don't care. And that's something, again, I've tried to be really critical of. Caring and connection and belonging, it's a species activity. And again, to assume that men aren't caring is really, really problematic. I was asked recently, actually, in a radio interview, if I thought that seeing men as caregivers was actually about trying to feminize men, and notwithstanding the sort of anti-feminist sentiment within that, this idea that men aren't caring is actually a really strange position to have. Lots of men are involved in all sorts of different forms of care, of nurturing, and again, it's about what we see and what we don't see. I think there's some really lovely social historical work as well that's starting to challenge this idea that men have always just been breadwinners, and of course we can look at it the other way around as well. Women have have always been employed or, been part of the labour market in particular ways. If we look at some sort of archive-based data, Laura King's work at the University of Leeds, she's done this lovely work on looking at men as caregivers in the 1950s, and she's uncovered this gorgeous data of men pushing babies around in prams, and we just simply weren't looking at them in that lens.
That's really interesting. And I guess another challenge here, there's a kind of tension, I guess, isn't there? And how can we find the balance between this real important need to include fathers more in services, but the fact that, in some cases, men might be perpetrating abuse, for example. So how do you deal with that kind of challenge, I suppose, that in some cases, men do pose a risk to children or to mothers or to members of staff. How do you view that kind of risk perspective, and how can those issues be addressed in your view?
I think it's really important that risk is identified. Of course, where people present a risk to other people, we need models of accountability. We need to be able to see that and recognise that and to address it. I go back to the systems question again. Do we think that as a society we provide the spaces for people to be held accountable? And I don't think we do. There are models out there. I know For Baby's Sake is a charity that engages with men who have perpetrated violence in the past, but they engage with men for the purposes of encouraging accountability and then also change and doing things differently. And the Caring Dads model, a great import from Canada, encourages or creates spaces for those kinds of discussions, those kinds of interventions. And we simply don't fund those as a society. And there's a postcode lottery as it is in terms of support for dads or support for men in general. So what I mean by that is, that they're in different places, but there are big gaps as well. And that's because the funding is fragmented or it's short term. And if we create, again, systems that enable us to intervene when that's necessary and needed, we try and reduce the perpetuation of that problem over time. So what we do really need, I think, are high accountability, but also gender sensitive interventions that enable men to have those kinds of conversations where that's needed and where that's necessary, and to stop that continuation, be it with the same partner or in new sets of relationships and new partnerships. So that again would be a systems change that is necessary, I think.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I guess just recently the UK government has launched its new strategy around ending violence against women and girls, and engaging men is quite a big part of that, which is good to see. But there's also a lot of quite punitive language, like coming down hard on perpetrators, which maybe then doesn't lend itself very well to, actually trying to change men's behaviour. But yeah.
I think there was a really interesting article that suggested that we need to target boys, and again, that language and that framing is quite deficit, really, and we do tend to talk about men in a deficit very often, and boys, and that's part of the issue. If we educate and we seek to understand and we seek to engage with young men and with men later in the life course, that's a very different framing. It's one where we can seek to understand and respond, but in a way that's less defensive, and in a way that again holds people to account, but also enables opportunities for development individually and personally.
I wanted to ask you, following on from that, what do you think the key elements of a sort of father inclusive approach across sectors, across services should be? I'm sure you've got quite a bit to say about that.
Yeah, so it's a language that it's empirically driven. So I'm sorry to use my research language, but it's something that professionals are talking about, and it's emerged or come from interviews with professionals. And I talked earlier about it being multidimensional. So it's about thinking about interpersonal relationships between professionals and fathers, trying to challenge where we might be sidelining fathers, even if inadvertently. when there's a need for surveillance, or for a better word, for understanding where a risk might be presented, about engaging with men again in a way that's kind of relational, and informed, and not overly confronting unless that's needed. It's about culture shifts, so it's about systems and services again being designed in ways that dads are recognised. So it can be very, again, simple things like using the language of father, instead of parent, in advertising for services. The reason sometimes that gets pushed back, but the reason that it's useful to use the language of father is because parent is so often seen as synonymous with mother. And dads don't necessarily always respond to that language in the same way that mums might. It's things like having imagery, positive imagery of fathers, and imagery of diverse fathers from lots of different backgrounds, minoritized fathers, low-income fathers, whoever that might be, young fathers. It's also about auditing services, I think, and checking in that fathers are being effectively engaged. It's about checking the visibility of fathers in particular spaces. One of the challenges at the moment is, I think, that we try to shoehorn men into what have traditionally been women's spaces, rather than being responsive to what it is that men need, and the kinds of spaces that they value. And we need to work with men to understand what that looks like. And that's where things like, the Young Dad Collective model, even the parent carer panels for family hubs now, are really important because they allow men to have a voice, particularly as fathers, around what it is they need. So again, to be inclusive, I think, is about not just sort of seeing it as an add-on, but seeing it as a must-have. And again, recognising that father involvement has really, really important outcomes for the whole family. So we know there's a whole history of interdisciplinary research about the benefits of father involvement for children. We can see over time improved outcomes developmentally, for socially, educationally, in all sorts of areas. For men themselves, being a father is really transformative. It can lead to mental health challenges, of course, and particularly in the early years. But over time, men invest in that identity, and it's a really positive, powerful identity. But we also know that women benefit too. So when dad's positively involved, we see better mental health outcomes for women. We see higher rates of breastfeeding and sort of, those kinds of health behaviours. So this isn't not just about supporting dad, but it's about supporting the whole family, and trying to really build kind of those longer term outcomes that ultimately benefit society, but benefit families, benefit everybody.
Sure. Is there a role for dads groups as well, and online parenting support groups? Are they part of the picture?
Yeah, definitely. I think they don't replace face to face. I think they work really well alongside spaces of community and belonging. Again, as a sociologist, what I'm really interested in is how these spaces are being created, and what they're replacing. And I think what they're replacing is kind of a breakdown of community, particularly for men. And it's a response to economic change, to the different kinds of jobs that are available to men. Those jobs used to be where men would have friendships, or they'd see other men, and that's kind of shifted. And I think that's why we now focus a lot more on fatherhood identities, because it's a shared identity that can bring men together, and sometimes with their children as well. They're playing a really important role, and they're making fatherhood visible in new ways as well. And it's really interesting to see it as kind of these grassroots movements, really, which, going back to Stephen's question about, this kind of, are there gender norms? Do men want to care, and be fathers? Yes, they really do. And they're showing us that through different campaigns or through community organising that are organised around being a dad.
We should mention as well, Anna, that you've been involved, haven't you, in kind of supporting this work and helping to develop new things as well. Like, I believe you're the chair of trustees for Northeast Young Dads and Lads, and you've also created this online tool called DigiDad. Did you want to say anything about any of the kind of exciting pieces of practical work you've been involved in?
Yeah, definitely. So I was chair of trustees for North Eastern Dads Lads for a couple of years, and finished this year. But we've done a lot of co-creation work with that group. So the North Eastern Dads and Lads is a brilliant charity based in the northeast of England. It's very distinctive in its sort of support for young fathers. And we've worked with young men to create content that's both voiced by young fathers, and there are images of young fathers. But what it does is it allows us to tackle a range of different kind of topics, if you like, that are relevant to young men, the things they'll be thinking about as they become a father, but in a way that's accessible. So essentially, what we've done is we've created lots of I say we, I've been involved in some of those things, but we've got video series, podcasts, voiced by young dads that talk about what it means to have a baby when they're not 3 months old, what kind of mental health challenges you might experience and where to get support from, and that's proven so powerful because it's been accessed as far as Peru, right? So it's globally of interest to people, and yeah, what we do send checks. So we work with professionals. We've worked with the NHS, for example, around there's a baby feeding series. That includes 3 different videos that look at breastfeeding, pumping milk, and then formula feeding. And we had to be quite careful in our negotiations around that, because the NHS promotes breastfeeding, but some of our young fathers, again, they struggle with that, or their partners struggle with that. So it's about trying to sort of marry together these different perspectives by working collaboratively, and then creating something that young men can access for free, can get a little bit of information, and really start to sort of build some of their confidence, and provide materials that mean that they don't necessarily have to disclose their lack of confidence or lack of knowledge in the ways that they might be reticent to do.
We haven't talked very much about policy and legislation. So, for example, leave arrangements and flexible working patterns, these kinds of areas, and how they can be and should be developed to support fatherhood and promote co-parenting, especially amongst fathers on low incomes or young fathers. I wondered if you wanted to talk about that. I'm thinking whilst I talk about this, about the great work that was done at European level over many years by the European Childcare Network and Network on Leave Arrangements. I can't remember the precise title, but Peter Moss's work, basically. They had a huge focus on this, and I think there have been significant improvements over time, particularly thinking back to the Blair government. But where are we now with that issue, and what needs to be done now?
The UK is pretty woeful with parental leave, particularly paternity leave. So fathers are still only entitled to 2 weeks of leave. The new Labour government has committed to a review of parental leave, and that's something that I've been involved with. But at the moment, things are shifting quite slowly. There's been a kind of a shift to the day one rights approach, which has just gone through the employment bill. But the fact is that men still only have an entitlement of 2 weeks. And if you, again, compare that to countries like Sweden, and there's 480 days and parents... It's a non-transferable model, so basically mum and dad have entitlements that they don't have to necessarily share. Compared to the UK, the problem we have is that there are offers like the shared parental leave approach, but that requires dads to take leave off mum, and that reinforces kind of conflict really between mums and dads, and that's gendered in certain ways. So there are some great campaigns, particularly from the Fatherhood Institute, the Dad Shift, around extending paternity leave to 6 weeks. So far that hasn't been achieved. It's really great that there are campaigns like that who are making that point and are trying to demonstrate the value of that. but the leave review is something that I think will hopefully help us to shift the dial slightly. So there was
Right.
like 70 academics involved in that. The evidence shows that the earlier or the longer leave that dads have, the more likely they are to invest in that identity as an involved father, and again to have longer term impacts and benefits for the wider family. So
Yeah.
so we're
And
still
of course,
behind, but yeah.
I mean, of course, a huge element of it is whether that leave is paid and what level it's paid at.
Yeah.
And this is a key reason why dads don't seem to take it up. And I mean, I think mothers have a reasonably generous maternity provision, but most of that is unpaid. So, there are huge issues around how resources interface
Yeah.
with this.
Yeah, and actually, our research with young dads shows that many of them aren't entitled to anything. So, a lot of them are self-employed. So actually, they come under the sort of the worker framing that the current parental leave system is based on, but they don't have any entitlements. A lot of our young men are on 0-hour contracts, balancing that with their partner's 0-hour contracts. So we've heard from some of the young men that they've gone to work the next day. So they've had their baby and then they're straight back to work, and they have to do that to make ends meet. Some of them who are in education have had to go back and do their GCSEs the next day, So again, there's kind of no flexibility in those systems to enable them to get any form of leave at all, let alone paid leave. And we have seen, shared parental leave, the uptake is something like 2%, because it doesn't map onto kind of existing sort of gender pay gaps and broader sort of structural challenges that mean that men are more likely to remain employed and remain in the workplace.
Yeah. I mean, I was at the hairdresser yesterday by chance, and we were talking about this because he's having a baby in 3 months, or his partner is, and he was saying, I don't know how much time I'll be able to take because I'm self-employed, So there's still quite a lot to do, isn't there? And also to do it in a way where we don't end up reducing mother's entitlement, and in order to bolster father's entitlement. So it's difficult.
Moving on to our last question, Anna. So the earliest work in your career focused on grandparenting. I think that was the topic of your PhD, for example, and especially grandfathering. So we were interested in what made you want to research that topic, and how and why did your kind of focus shift then from grandfathers to fathers?
Yeah, so my undergraduate dissertation was a focus group, or involved a focus group with my granddad and my maternal granddad and some of his sort of friends locally. I'd been really inspired by Raewyn Connell's work on masculinities, and it occurred to me that there wasn't very much on granddads. There wasn't very much on older men and their care responsibilities. So I did this lovely focus group and decided to pursue that and do a PhD. And that PhD actually was kind of going to focus on intergenerational relations between men. So originally I was going to look at granddads, fathers and sons, but it was the granddads who were kind of most accessible, really, in some ways. So, they were available during the day, and we're actually really interested in the research. So like, no one's ever asked us this question. No one's ever asked us what it to be a granddad, But then, fascinatingly, and I talk about this a lot, but I always opened with a question like, tell me about yourself, and they would talk about employment and work first, even though the study was about granddads. So I found that really interesting. But what was really interesting about that work was, that again, there's all these kinds of forms of caregiving going on, but men do talk about it in quite gendered terms. So they often talked about, my wife did the domestic stuff and I do the fixing and the kind of the rough play and all of that, which I found really interesting. And it sort of showed like a gender division of labour that kind of occurs across the life course. But they, the grandfathers in that study were predominantly, I'd say, resourced. They had secure homes. They retired early, not entirely, not across the board, but that was certainly the kind of main focus. So again, I was looking at kind of middle class families really, and I'm able to see these gender divisions of labour. But some of the men involved in that study were kinship carers. So they'd taken on the care of their grandchildren when the parent generation was no longer able to, for whatever reason. And I found that really fascinating. And it was a very different kind of grandparenting to what I've later come to call the leisure pleasure grandparenting of the PhD study. Corin Hughes at the time was researching low income grandparents, and they used the language of rescue and repair grandparenting for in kinship care, because they were stepping in, having to sort of take the children or rescue the children from particular contexts, and then repair those relationships, or repair family. So seeing that sort of really classed dimension was in grandparenting was really fascinating. Then during my time at the Open University, when I met Sandy, I started working with Breach Featherstone, and we were doing an evaluation of the family rights group advice and advocacy telephone line, and there were lots of kinship carers ringing that advice line, seeking support around how to resource their families. So several of them, their children are dropped off overnight, and it's kind of like, take your grandchildren, or would have to be placed in care. So they're having to make these really, really difficult decisions about whether they can actually provide that support unexpectedly, in unanticipated ways, and that kind of led me to this broader question around how do I explain those experiences? These are men who are, and women, who are having to do family in a really different way, and in a way that again requires a lot of different forms of resourcing from the state, a new identity as a kinship carer. That's a very different thing to being a grandparent, a biological grandparent. So I was looking for existing research, thinking about different research frameworks that would help me to make sense of that. And that's when I really started observing this lack of data, lack of information, lack of theory around men's care responsibilities across the life course, and how that shifts and changes. And eventually that formed the baseline sort of question for a Leverhulme Trust early career fellowship, which led to the Fathering in Poverty book. And I started to look at men in low income contexts. And kinship care renders families kind of less resourced automatically, because you have to provide care at last minute. You don't necessarily have any sort of a great deal of financial support. There is some financial support from local authorities, but it's time limited. And I was talking to men in the Fathering in Poverty study who were in their sort of mid-50s, were asked to leave work to provide care and to settle their grandchildren, because they'd had a lot of trauma in their backgrounds. And then were asked, well, when are you going to go back to work? And how are you going to look after the grandchildren when the state funding runs out? And of course, they're sort of towards retirement age, and they're going, well, I don't know how I'm going to get that work. So that's kind of always been helped me to uncover kind of, again, the sort of welfare-based challenges that men are experiencing, but also doing that on behalf of their families. And it's trying to think about, people are not just doing things because they're a man or a woman. They're doing things because they're a mum or a granddad or a dad or an uncle, and our family identities drive what it is we do. The Fathering in Poverty study was where I first sort of got engaged with the young fatherhood research. So I looked at existing data. So that's when I became connected to following young fathers. But I suppose the thing that's held everything together that I've been researching and interested in is those intersections between, being low income, how we frame and think about fatherhood or men's care responsibilities, and what that looks like across the life course as well.
Your research kind of reminds me of a few episodes ago we interviewed Stephen Roberts, and I think both of your work shows, like, even though there are many challenges, like, actually lots of men are seeking to find ways to care for others and are challenging some of the stereotypes that exist about them. And actually, sometimes that is in quite unexpected places, or places where people don't look so much like working class communities. So I feel like your research does give us quite a hopeful picture in the end, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think there's an optimism And I don't say that to sort of go, well, things aren't going to change, and I'm just hopeful it will, But it's about, it's that recovery of particular experiences through different lenses that help us to see what it is that drives us in particular ways, And I make a case that we need to retain a focus on family and family identities, because that is how a lot of us live our lives, and that is what drives us now, and unfortunately society doesn't always value that in the way that it could and it should. But if we can, again, create the conditions where we recognise the value of fatherhood and the value of that for everybody, in that system, then hopefully we can start to shift the dial and do things slightly differently in a more transformative way.
The thing that just occurs to me is that many of us, work on these issues, research these issues, and then we become parents during the research process, and that's kind of fascinating, because how does research and practice of being a parent match up or not, and when your kids come home from school and say, I think boys are like this or girls like that, and you think, oh no, how do I deal with this? But there's some real challenges, and I think it's quite it's great, really, that you have to face these challenges at home as well, and really work them out and think, well, this is what other people are dealing with.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a mum of 2 children, and it's a big part of my identity. But I remember I didn't take to motherhood like a duck to water, like I thought other people were doing, and between me, I'm married and have been for a long time, but we've had to negotiate, navigate, try and work out who's doing what and when, and work out if you're resentful at certain points and why that is. And sometimes it is just because you've got these assumptions, you're making these assumptions all the time, and you sort of have to work through those, but it's not always straightforward.
No, but that's what makes it all very interesting, if challenging on occasions. But thank you so much for talking to us today, Anna. It's been really great listening to you.
Thank you. So interesting. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, Sandy, I love that conversation with Anna, and and I do find that little discussion we had at the end about grandfathers and other extended family members interesting, because I am an uncle myself, and I very much love my nieces, my young nieces, and I am very keen to play a kind of positive role in their lives, and I guess I do find that really interesting, the role that, it's not something which we discuss very much, but I think it's something which has a lot of potential, doesn't it? The role that other family members can play including men, in caring for children, for example, or just being a positive presence in their lives. And then in turn, what impact does that have on us? Does that help to shift ideas about masculinity somehow in our lives? What about you? Is there anything that you would like to have a little ramble about?
Well, just on you mentioned grandfathers there, Stephen. I did some work quite a while ago, a review of services run by what was then called Age Concern, with disadvantaged older men, and it's now Age UK. And one of the things I think was noticeable about that work was how little the men mentioned, because I did do some focus groups there, how little they mentioned grandparenting, and actually quite a few of those men, they were defined as disadvantaged, but they were really disconnected. And they were often living on their own without much support, without really being noticed. They might get out of the house rarely, and they might go to a pub club once a month or something. But really, the family connections just didn't seem to be there. And there are probably many reasons behind that. Bereavement, and family living miles away, and so on. But it was actually quite sad, and so it's quite a contrast to what Anna was saying about middle-class older men being grandfathers and being active grandfathers. And I see that around me in the community that I'm part of. There are lots of guys around here, this is East Oxford, who are very, very involved as grandparents, and they really, love their role and find it's very important to them. So there are lots of different strands, I think, in that sort of grandparenting sphere.
Yeah.
And it's important to tease those out a bit further, really.
Totally. But it could be something that can make a real positive difference to older men's lives.
Well, I mean, the other thing about older men, of course, is they grow up. Boys, young men tend to grow up with these norms of be tough, be strong, be independent, be in control, and then of course these older guys, certainly the ones I'm talking about, they can't really meet those expectations, and so they feel diminished, and in some ways they are diminished, and so I think that's quite an issue for them. So anyway, I'm moving away from sort of fathering issues there, but there's quite a lot going on there. We should return to that issue, actually.
Absolutely, yes. And I do think that Anna's research is really interesting as well, because I think it really shows how, if we're talking about gender norms and expectations about masculinity, this isn't simply something which is within individual attitudes or behaviours, but actually it's something which is embedded in our institutions, and it's being reproduced by our institutions, and so even if we might want to go against those gender norms, we might actually want to play a really active, caring role in our lives as men, as fathers, that actually sometimes the system can make that really difficult, that if it actually just makes a lot more economic sense for you as the father to continue, being the kind of so-called breadwinner, and for the mother to take time off work because that's just economically easier, for various reasons, then that kind of reproduces that gender norm, even if nobody actually wants to go along with that. But that just shows how difficult it can be to shift these things, and how it is as much about systemic institutional change as it is about how we kind of see things as individuals, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think that sort of separation that you're talking about there, I mean, I think there's research that suggests that it tends to grow over time. So, if mothers are working part-time when the kids are young, the dad's doing full-time work, and then over time, that separation can become more marked, and the mother can often give up work completely, So, again, the norms become reinforced in that way.
Yeah.
And I was sort of thinking in relation to this, what is the role of legislation and policy? And we talked a bit about this with Anna, but my understanding of the Swedish experience is that the only leave that men really take there are the dedicated so-called daddy months. I'm not sure it is a month now, but might be slightly longer than that. But that's the leave that they do take, because it's specifically for them, and it can't be transferred, And so I think in some cases there is a role for I don't know if this is the right way to put it, but sticks as well as carrots. You have to push guys to engage in this way sometimes. It's not just a matter of saying, it would be nice if. And I'm sure a lot of them benefit very, very much from those dedicated daddy months. And I imagine Iceland, I think, is even more progressive on this.
I think you're right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I do think there's something interesting as well, isn't there, more at the interpersonal level, that perhaps sometimes mothers might be a bit reluctant to facilitate, or, fathers playing a more active role in some aspects of caregiving, for example, because if that is the one domain in which, you have been able to have more power and influence and control in your life, and indeed if that's how your identity is defined as a woman, then it can feel quite difficult then to, let men into that. And perhaps especially if men, we're just often not raised, are we, to develop those caring, emotional, communicative skills to, in the same way, that maybe we won't do as good a job, at least to begin with. But then I guess equally the only way we can get better is through practice. But so it's just a difficult one, isn't it, in terms of for both people in a relationship, to enable men to develop these caregiving skills more, I suppose.
You just made me think actually of Lindsay Gall's great book Slow Motion, Changing Masculinities, Changing Men, and she says in there, and I might get this quote slightly wrong, but she says something along the lines of, women are not uniquely qualified to clean the toilet bowl, men can do this too, something along that line.
Exactly.
And I think there's obviously some sense in this.
Totally. And these things are, they have to be learned by women and girls as well, do they? Yeah, they're not just
precisely
somehow born within them. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, as always, everybody, for listening. Hopefully you found this episode suitably festive for this time of year. Do look after yourselves. Contact us at nowandmen@gmail.com if you have any questions or comments about the podcast. Please do subscribe to it on your podcast service if you haven't done so already, and share it with family and friends. Speaking of family, of course. And we'll be back with another episode soon.
Thanks, Stephen. And maybe my Christmas present to you is that I'm going to learn the last portion of our episodes and try and get it right.
I'll take that. I'll take that.
Take the responsibility away.
Of course, you did already get me one Christmas present, Sandy. You got me The Vegetarian, the book by Han Kang that you mentioned in our previous episode about South Korea. So that will be a second present. So that's very kind of you.
Well, you're very welcome, Stephen.
Thank you. And take care of yourself, Sandy, and take care of yourselves, everybody.
And speak to you in the new year.
Yes. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.